So first of all, welcome everyone to the webinar. I'm not exactly sure. I don't want to take any more time than I absolutely have to. We're really just going to be scratching the surface, unfortunately, with regard to how to lead volunteer emergency responders. So you'll also notice that there is chat on the right. So let's see here if that, I'll just make sure that that is viewable for everybody. I just want to verify that. Yeah, perfect. All right, great. Okay. So let's dive into this. So the topic of tonight's webinar is leading volunteer emergency responders. It's really the same as any other volunteer group or paid service, only different. And we'll be talking a little bit more about what that looks like, some of the differences. And it's important that we do recognize that there are differences. Some are very obvious, some maybe not so much. So the topics that we'll cover: the current landscape of volunteerism, leadership concepts. We'll talk about something that we call the source of influence with regard to how as leaders, we impart or we influence the behavior of others, essentially, how we create a culture within our organization. We'll talk about recruiting and a particular concept within recruiting that we'll pay a particular attention to is the onboarding process. So from the point where we first touch that potential member to bring them on board. And then once we bring them on board, how do we keep them? Because it's painfully obvious, I think, in any corporate circles or any organizational literature that you read, it's far less expensive, both in time and money, which are typically in short supply in unpaid professional services. It's far easier to keep a member happy than it is to go through the time to recruit again. So I'll start with a little bit of my journey, and it's not one that's atypical, so it's actually a typical journey. And I tell you for a number of reasons, one of which I will refer to my own journey throughout my background in volunteering over the past, it's been 28 years now, I suppose. So I remember I was 18 years old, and so do the math. I don't look that old, and I do appreciate those comments. So I remember it was a weekend, I think, and I was watching TV. I was living at home, and at the time, like Channel 10 or the community news events came up. I think it was Shaw or Videotron or something like that in Edmonton, and there was an ad that said, "Are you interested in first aid, survival, navigation, and helping people or something? If so, call this number." And I thought to myself, I'm 18. Let's see here. Is there sports on there? No, that wasn't something. Stereo? No. Drinking? No, that wasn't it. Girls? No, none of that. Why would I be interested? Clearly, I'm not the demographic. Now, that said, I phoned the number, and the rest is essentially history. So I started in volunteer search and rescue. We were meeting every night and 2 weekends a month, I think, at that time. And during that time, we did lost and missing people searches and helping out law enforcement. And I've seen the evolution of that whole world, both on the operational side. But in reference to what we're talking about tonight, is I saw a real change in my life and volunteerism. During that period of time, hundreds of SAR missions, Pine Lake Tornado in 2000. So that was kind of the first emergency management exposure that I had as a volunteer. 2005, Hurricane Katrina. 3 of us headed down there and worked out of Mississippi and Louisiana primarily. And then a couple weeks later, Hurricane Rita hit. No one really remembers that. We headed back down for that one. In 2007, I joined a group called Canada Task Force 2. And that team was specific in that it was one of 4 at the time national teams that would respond to large-scale structural collapses at that time. So think parkades, malls, something like that. Our role within that changed. It didn't change, but we added what we call an incident management team component to that. So we've responded to Slave Lake fires, floods in Calgary and High River, most recently Fort McMurray in 2016. Now, I tell you that for a few reasons, one of which during that evolution of my SAR career and public safety and emergency management, I was also going through a whole bunch of changes, like just think from 18 and now I'm 46, a whole bunch of changes with regard to my volunteerism, my time, the context by which I volunteer, and we'll talk about that. So that gives you a little bit of background. And as I said, I don't think it's atypical, maybe the longevity of it, because obviously I'm not that smart and I'm continuing to volunteer all of this time, but that's a conversation for another webinar. So what is the state of volunteerism? I think the tide has certainly turned to a certain extent. I remember when I first started my leadership journey, my volunteerism journey, I was in awe with regard to, the organization, what it did. I was really, really interested in all the cool gear. I was really wanting to help the organization. And I think things have changed. And I'm not here to talk about millennials versus Gen X's versus Gen this, that, A, B, C, D, and whatever, and sometimes Y. But I think in talking to a lot of people in the fire services, SAR, volunteer EMS in rural communities, all across the map, across the world for that matter. When I go to New Zealand, these are the same kind of issues, same kind of trends that we're seeing in New Zealand and Australia as we're seeing in Canada and the United States, where it's no longer what the organization needs from me, it's about what I need from the organization. We'll talk a bit more about that, but I'm going to say the word entitled, and I don't mean it in a completely negative way, but essentially what's happening, I think now, is volunteers are sizing up the organization, deciding, is this the right organization for me? When I first started, I could care less. It was, cool gear. It was helping people, all those things. I didn't even think about that. But nowadays, there's so much competition. There's competition for time, attention, money. And we'll talk about volunteering in emergency services here shortly, but where else would you have to pay money in gear and training in some cases to belong to a volunteer organization, to do an official function? I don't get it. But anyways, we'll talk about that. But no matter what the reasoning is, I'm not a socio-economic genius by any stretch, but the recognition, I think, is pretty clear that volunteerism has changed. Numbers are dwindling. The passing of the torch from one to another, from a generation, passing that baton down, so on and so forth, especially in things like the fire service where tradition is so important. Heck, people that own businesses now don't have their kids available or wanting to take over their business. Just things are different. So as an organization, as leaders of organizations, we have to adapt to that, and we have to shift our thinking, because when we started, maybe the paradigm was a certain way, but now the recognition has to be there that we need to think differently about how we're treating our unpaid professionals, our volunteers. So a typical environment is not this one. And this is from Shackleton. Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months, complete darkness. Doesn't really apply to your typical volunteer environment. And that typical volunteer environment is maybe it's the homeless shelter, maybe it's the food bank, maybe it's working for blood services, maybe it's helping out at a local community. Maybe it's, advocating for the environment, something like that. When I talk about typical, that's really what I'm talking about, in kind of typical way, when we think about volunteering. And I just have visions of, the older retired guy or gal, they're now done with their corporate world, and they just want to go and they just want to volunteer and help out at their local community and not give a shit about anything else. They've been there, done that. They just want to give something back. That's kind of your typical environment. So the typical motivation, and I'm telling you this because we're going to contrast that with our audience, really, they want something less stressful than their daily jobs. They like routine and the predictability. And they certainly don't like jumping through a bunch of hoops to belong to an organization. Easy peasy. They don't want to rock the boat. They want something that's comfortable. They want something maybe for increased interaction or companionship or something like that. Something that's completely different than their regular life. That's why typically people volunteer for these quote unquote typical organizations. And kudos to them. That's probably not necessarily my speed at all. That's just not something that's appealing to me personally. But thank goodness there are lots and lots and lots of people that do go and do those things on a regular basis. I applaud them and I love that about them and what they do. So let's look at our audience now. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I pulled this off of Volunteer Alberta's site, and I found it quite interesting. If we go through the list here, these are things in terms of why people volunteer their time. And again, we'll take a look at our particular audience. The reason it's important is because our audience is unique, and I think we already know that. Generosity, opportunity to give back, passion. It's a way to make a difference about something you care about. Yep, absolutely. Resourcefulness, opportunity to accomplish some things in your community that otherwise wouldn't get done. Maybe it's building of a playground, for example. Connection. It's a great way to meet new people and become part of a community. Perfect. We're actually going to hit on that one here shortly. Belonging can help to improve your language skills and get acquainted with a new culture. Yeah, absolutely. We're not talking necessarily, nationality and things like that, but even volunteerism has its own culture in itself. If you ask any corporate person that's coming into the volunteer environment, they often just shake their head at the lack of governance, lack of decision-making ability, so on and so forth. So yeah, we talk about, new culture. That's it. Health. Volunteering has been shown to improve overall health and well-being. I don't have the stats for that, but it's on Volunteer Alberta's website. So all right, I can buy that. Ambition. Builds your team's resume and offers great work experience. That's something I think that we see an awful lot of in the emergency services world, particularly when it comes time for applying for other jobs. It's super competitive to get onto fire departments and get into health services or pre-hospital care. There's a lot of things you have to do, even just to apply. And then once you're in the pipeline, all of your work experience, your volunteer experience, all of that comes into play. So I think that's a really, really big one. Can offer new knowledge and skills, adventure. It's a chance to try something new or different. Enjoyment. It can be a lot of fun. Yeah, it can be. Except in our environment, sometimes you're bagging a body. You're responding to the worst situations ever. You're responding to fatalities. You're responding to suffering. You're responding to a lot of things that I would submit folks at the food bank maybe aren't exposed to. At least I would hope not. If that's the case, that's an odd food bank you belong to. But there is a lot of fun around what we do, certainly. Reciprocity, great perks like food, tickets, parties, and swag. In SAR, I guess that means we can eat pizza and Subway a lot, I suppose, and not pay for it. So yeah, I guess there's a few things there that we can start to see. Now I'm going to take a quick little side movement here, and I will also allow you to download the presentation here. So you should see shortly the opportunity to download this presentation. So go ahead, feel free to download that at your leisure. In addition, I'll also mention that I'll make the presentation available in follow-up emails and so on and so forth. Now that everyone's on, I'm actually just quite curious if you can just pipe up and put in some comments in terms of where you're from. Not necessarily what agency you're with, unless you want to, but certainly feel free. Just take a few seconds here, throw into the chat where you're from, and let's get a good cross section here and see where we're at. All right, Wabasca, Saskatchewan. All right, Kisby, Saskatchewan. Ryan, sorry, I'm out, buddy. I don't know where that is. It's in Saskatchewan. That's all I got. Slave Lake. Delane, how are you? Good to see you, sort of, virtually speaking. Where else we got? Manitoba Fire, GSAR, Katie, nice. I know the Office of the Fire Commissioner folks quite well out of Brandon, having spent a lot of time with Tobin and I think Scott, those folks, awesome. Mark Emmerich, I think, as well. So Joel, Edmonton, Darren, Grand Prairie, Steve, perfect. Darren, New Zealand. All right, perfect. Brent, fantastic. Canuso, Alberta. Kieran, nice. Red Lake, Ontario, fantastic. So we've got a really good cross section here. Invermere, BC. Thank you, Jason. And Northwest New Brunswick. That's fantastic. Well, thank you very much for chiming in. And I took a bit of time because to ask for that, because oftentimes the feed needs to get equalized or whatever the case is. So thank you very much for that. All right, now let's talk about our folks. All right, now the Men Wanted, not to be sexist, but this is an actual ad that went out back in the day. Ernest Shackleton heading to Antarctica, a journey of which I will be undertaking myself later this winter, leaving November 28th, but I digress. Men Wanted, hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. Ernest Shackleton, 4 Burlington Street. Now, I say volunteers are odd, and I say this as one, actually, but where else would you have a group of folks that, for example, you know, I work for a big corporation for about 10 years. If my pager went off in the middle of the night, I would come up with every reason not to answer it, frankly. I would be, you know, sick, you know, tired, whatever it might be. My grandma passed away again, 4th time this week, tough week, whatever it might look like. But in search and rescue, in fire services and EMS, when the pager goes off, it's like, it's kind of good. We're like, oh, gotta go. Perfect. So you get out of bed, you answer it. Maybe it's a return text. Yeah, on my way. You get some details and so on and so forth. And then details start to arrive, and it's shitty weather. Wow, good. Excellent. That means I can wear one of my 7 Gore-Tex coats I have. It's a vulnerable person, somebody maybe that is not well suited for that weather. Oh, all right, interesting. Let's do this. And so on and so on and so forth. And then let's add on the fact that a lot of our vehicle choices are based on our volunteer activity. Is that kind of weird or what? Yeah, I think it's pretty weird. I have 8 headlamps. How many do I actually need at any given time? Probably 1, but I have a whole bunch. And it costs me a bunch of money. Like, these aren't cheap little headlamps that you get at Walmart. These are like high-end ones, Petzls, and so on and so forth. That's weird to me, but that's very typical of the folks that join our organizations. And we'll talk again a bit more about what that looks like. So when we talk about the things that motivate, all of these other things, other factors with typical volunteer environments, they don't actually apply to us in a certain way. Because let's face it, it's all about stress. It's all about, excitement, so on and so forth. So throw out some ideas here. And Bruce Green, Courtney, BC, excellent. Why do folks volunteer for our organizations? I'd be curious. Let's chime up on the chat. We'll be able to break those down. Why are they joining SAR? Why are they joining FIRE? Why are they joining EMS? So on and so forth. Where's some ideas? Yeah, excitement. You bet, Ryan. Yeah, I'm reading what you're picking up, what you're putting down. Yeah, helping people, learning new skills to give back. Yep. Challenges. Yeah, I would agree with that, Steve. Keep it coming. Yeah, to help people. Yep. Community and thrill. All right. All right. So we've got a couple of for the excitement. Let's do one more. Somebody give me another one. Meet new people. Yeah, Jason, Darren, learn new skills. Yeah, absolutely. I would agree to a certain extent about all of those. We're going to deep dive into it a little bit more. Because while those are help your neighbors, yeah, maybe a tax rebate. Yeah. Christine, nice. Sweet webinars. I like that. I like that. I'm going to submit to you that while all of those are probably correct, I don't think that those are 100% at the root of why people volunteer, particularly for our organizations. So remember that big long list of reasons that I showed you earlier? Well, I think it really comes down to the number one questions that volunteers are asking themselves. Really, what's in it for me? Yeah, and Katie, department has become like a family. Education is irreplaceable. Closure for, yeah. Okay, Dennis, we're going to talk about closure for families. Thank you. So the number one question that volunteers are asking themselves, what's in it for me? And here is a key tenet, and especially as leaders of organizations, don't ever, 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 ever forget this. We volunteer not for what we do or have to do or get to do, but how it makes us feel. All right, I'm going to say that again. We don't volunteer for what we do and get to do. We volunteer because of how it makes us feel, how it makes us feel about ourselves, our contributions, all of those things. So when we talk about helping your neighbors, learning new skills, meeting new people, community and thrill, and so on and so forth, the root of that then is because of how it makes us feel. Because otherwise, I would volunteer at the homeless shelter. And again, I'm not, that's just not my thing. And God bless those individuals that volunteer there. Well, then why don't you go do that? Why are you picking something that at 3 o'clock in the morning, your pager goes off? Pager. Sorry about that. It's not like The Hangover, pager friendly. That your phone goes off. That's crazy. Why would you volunteer at an organization that your vehicle choice, your volunteerism comes into play with that? Like, that makes no sense to me. Why would you volunteer to something that costs thousands of dollars worth of gear? So on and so forth. So ultimately, we join organizations because of how they make us feel. So when we talk about, Katie, the like my family, the camaraderie, the sense of community, that's because, we'll get into it in more detail, but we are social animals, but we are ultimately acting in a certain way that makes us feel a certain way. And we're going to act if that gives us the most pleasure, frankly, the most bang for our buck, all of those things. So it's about relationships is why we join organizations. And the reason that we join SAR and EMS and FIRE is because it's often like-minded people. It's people that are odd. It's people that do like the 3 a.m. call, which is crazy to me. Been doing it 28 years. Like, that makes no sense to me, but it doesn't matter. When my phone goes off, my heart races, I'm at it, right? So, but I'm surrounded by people like Dennis and so on and so forth that are like-minded folks and actually enjoy doing what we're doing. So that sense of community is really, really strong. Now, when I talk about relationships, there's really a few at play. It's the relationship between an individual to the service. So I'm a member of, say, Edmonton Regional Search and Rescue. What is my relationship to the service? Or if I'm a local firefighter, what is my, or Delane or anybody, if you're with Slave Lake SAR, whatever that might look like. That's that relationship. And then what's your relationship among fellow members? And this is now where I refer to with the sense of camaraderie, those sorts of things, like-minded people. Back when I first started in SAR, and I see it lesser now because of time and a bunch of other things, we would have our meetings, we'd have training, and then we'd sit in the parking lot for like another friggin' hour chatting, getting along with people because we truly enjoyed each other's company. So there's the individual to the service. There's our relationships amongst each other. And then there's the relationship to the community. We need to be hyper aware of what that looks like. What is the community's impressions of our organization? So for instance, if you're volunteering at the Boat and Sportsman Show or whatever that some sort of public service event, and if people consistently came up to you and said, "Man, you guys freaking suck." Yeah. Why do you do that? You suck. You should be doing something else, loser. Look at that uniform. That doesn't even, who wears a uniform for the volunteer stuff? Whatever that looks like, chances are that would make you feel very good about yourself, so you're probably not going to volunteer. So that's a critical relationship as well. So what is that relationship to the service, amongst fellow members, and to the community? We're going to talk a lot about the individual and service relationship coming up. And it starts with you as the leader. And so, and to lead, there's nothing more rewarding than to reunite a family. And we'll talk about that. That's, super important points here that we're bringing up, like help your neighbors and so on and so forth. And it starts with you as the leader. Now, you might not be the leader of the organization, but you are the leader of a team. Maybe you are the leader of that particular organization. Maybe you're an officer, something like that. Maybe you have some sort of leadership role within it. Starts with you. And one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, why would anyone follow you? Right? It's different in volunteer world. This is one of the biggest differences I've seen with regard to a paid service and an unpaid professional or volunteer service. This is what I mean. If we take a look at this, why should anyone follow you? People follow you based on choice. And it really changes, at least hopefully it changes as leadership evolves. So right off the bat, a new recruit comes in, or a potential recruit comes in. Right off the bat, you have position, we call it position power. Just by virtue of the fact that you're the president of an organization, you're the chief, you're deputy chief, you're lieutenant, you're captain, whatever that position might be for your organization, you're granted that. And people will give you that leeway, especially in emergency services where bars, that looks pretty impressive, especially when you don't know really the lay of the land. So you've got that, but that's pretty weak ultimately. Okay. It's really, really weak. So what you want to try to do is you want to move from position power to expert power. And I did a picture of a hazmat crew in particular because hazmat crews, for example, when they arrive on scene, they have the expert power. There's not a lot of people that know as much about what they're dealing with than they do. So as a result, no matter what the rank might be, that hazmat crew comes in. Search and rescue is another example where we come in and we are the experts, at least the perceived experts. So we are given a lot of leeway with regard to strategies. Hey, don't go out into the search area because we've got this. There's all sorts of reasons why, and so on and so forth. So we have position, we have expert, and then ultimately we want to get to respect power. This is really where true leadership lies, is in that respect power. Position, yeah, it's weak. Expert, a lot stronger. Respect is where we all want to get to, regardless of paid, unpaid, and so on and so forth. Okay. And so when we talk about respect power, the reason it's so important is because respect is something that's now intrinsic. It's internal. If you think about position power, that's often something external. That's something I see, and almost a sense of fear when I see somebody walk in and they have a higher rank than me. Don't mistake that with respect. Yeah, I might respect that position for sure, but what about the individual? So respect power is that intrinsic below what we call below the waterline, that is where we ultimately want to get to. Because if I respect you as a leader, I will do a whole bunch of things. Versus if you have position power, I'll probably do a bunch of things, but only the things that you tell me. I'm not probably going to go above and beyond. So particularly in volunteer world, respect power is really, really important, because if you keep playing that position card, the unpaid folks are going to be bailing left, right, and center. All right. So keep that in mind. We want to get to that respect power. The other component here, this is one of my favorite slides of all time, leadership presence. Okay. So we talked about leadership influence, leadership presence, and what kind of aura, what kind of climate do you create as a leader? Are you one that walks into a room and sucks all the energy out of it? Are you the type of leader that walks into a room and starts sharpshooting people with what's wrong? Are you the type of leader that walks in, on the other end of the spectrum and can't make a friggin' decision, or want to be everyone's friend all of the time? There's a lot of things that fall into that. But the bottom line is leadership presence is that almost indescribable way by which you conduct yourself, and by definition and association, how others react around you. Now, I think this is where one of the areas has changed quite dramatically in leadership with regard to, especially emergency services, and I still see it all. I've taught hundreds, if not thousands, of first responders, and I still see it in this day and age where it's all about the leader. It's an autocratic, fear-based, you will do this, otherwise, if I wanted your opinion, I'll give it to you, or we're doing it because we've always done it that way. The saying about fire department, 100 years of tradition, never impeded by progress. That absolutely still lives out there on the front lines. And I think we've all seen it. Now, hopefully it's not permeating our own organizations, but think about the presence there. That's the Darth Vader, right? If you think about how people act and react around those types of individuals, they're scared shitless. They're walking on eggshells. They're not going to tell you bad news. Why would they? Because you're going to take their head off. That's important, because when the chips are down, when there's an emergency, these things matter. So with regard to leadership, what you say matters. How you say it matters. How you act matters. And what's really interesting is your followers, the people that you work with, are constantly evaluating those things. What you say, how you say it, even what you don't say, and how you act. It's a constant evaluation. And all of that goes into what we call leadership presence. Volunteers in particular are hypersensitive to that, because they are constantly evaluating whether this organization, this cause, is worth their time. Because remember, they're competing, or you're competing for their time and their attention. Some of them are really skeptical, and they're literally evaluating constantly. So you have to be aware of, as a leader, what kind of presence do you have? What kind of culture are you creating amongst your volunteer organization? Because it matters. It really, really does. Tying it back to people volunteer in an organization because of how they feel. All right, really, really important. And we'll talk again about the why here. And so we see some really good answers in the chat with regard to why people continue to volunteer. And it's not what we think. So that leads us into leadership styles. And at the end of each chapter, by the way, or each topic, I'll have some takeaways for you that will tie a lot of this in. If you take a look at that graph, what it's telling us is on the bottom axis there, that would be the x-axis. Man, oh man, I should go back to school. Subordinate experience level, and then on the other axis, the amount of direction required. All right. So what you see in the lower left is low. So let's look at the bottom axis. Low subordinate experience level to high. Low to high on the left side. All right. So in terms of a directing style of leadership, What that means is I am being very direct. I am being very specific. I am telling you not only what you need to do, but I'm probably going to tell you how to do it. Okay? That's what we call a directing style. And in fact, oftentimes it's associated with, the whole arm like this. That means you mean business, right? Not this, but that. So that has a time and a place, especially when time is a factor, safety is an issue. I'm not going to have time to sit around and have a big diatribe and a big conversation. Absolutely, there's a time and a place for directing style, no matter who you're talking to. Absolutely. But what we're saying here is that when you have a low subordinate experience level, directing style is really, really good. It's pertinent, it's required, and it's exactly what the subordinate, the person that is following you, requires, because they don't know really what you're asking. They certainly don't know how, and they don't know really what the result needs to be. So being very specific works really, really well with new people. Perfect. Now, as the experience level starts to move and people get more experience, more training, so on and so forth, you can and should move from you will do this to a participating style. And what that means is you're going to engage them a little bit more. Hey, we've got this problem. We have a search segment we need to do. Or maybe it's a particular incident with regard to cutting somebody out of a vehicle. Whatever that looks like, you start to bring them in a participating way, and you're asking for their input, their dialogue. Now, again, this doesn't need to be a big meeting around a boardroom or you head back into the unit and have this big conversation, pros and cons, but it's actually bringing people in and asking what they think, asking for some input, asking for some ideas on direction. And ultimately, it does a bunch of different things. One, it shows them that you trust them. Two, it also builds their decision-making ability, okay? And three, you know what? Sometimes it's actually a good idea to ask others what the opinion is. Just think about the leadership presence, right? So if you're constantly directing, no one's going to think on their own. Now, as we move along to that subordinate experience level so that they're high, you can actually start to delegate. Really, really important. So you go directing, participating, delegating style. Let's get to the high end of the experience level and we can start to delegate. That's important. So those are the three broad styles, and you can also apply this to how we make decisions, okay? Directing, participating, and delegating. Really, the approach is based on time and risk, but certainly should really be around the experience level. All right, so let's blast through this. Leadership takeaways: be deliberate and conscious of your leadership. Is what I'm doing, saying, or how I'm acting adding to or detracting from respect influence? And consider your audience. Am I using the right leadership style for their level of expertise and experience? Ask yourself that. Power tip, refer to this slide. So this one right up here, often it's a pretty simple graphic. It's a pretty simple slide. So Kieran, yes, you ask a fantastic question. So this all works in theory, but what about an individual that's spread, you have a team that's beyond, it's running the entire gamut? Well, again, it's being very specific. And we'll talk about that in training as well. Kieran, it's a great question. But no matter who you're talking to, you can go right down to the individual. Think about it. Is this the right style when I'm talking to this individual? How many years of experience do they have? Are they capable, competent? Well, if they are that, then you should be leaning towards this participating and delegating style. If you're talking to somebody that's been in the organization for 15 years, then you can really start to use participating and delegating styles. So it really goes down to the individual level as well. And it's just being a lot more aware, because what we tend to do, Kieran, again, great question, is that we treat everyone the same. If all we have is a hammer, or every problem's a nail. If all I know how to do is direct, then I'm going to be directing. And that's going to piss off a lot of people that have 10 years of experience, and in some cases more experience than you have. So just be very aware of the style that you're using, and recognizing that everyone is at a different level of that subordinate experience level. So that's a really good question. So now when we talk about recruiting, really The tangible part I want to talk about here is our onboarding process in particular. And it starts with how you act in and interact with the community to include other stakeholders. So how does your organization interact with police, other fire departments, SAR groups, other community members, EMS, all of those things? It's not just members of the public, because one of our greatest referrals is our fellow stakeholders in emergency services. So many times somebody will walk up to the Mounties and say, hey man, how do I volunteer for the local fire department or SAR or whatever? Guess what? If your organization has a bad reputation or something like that, then your stakeholders, your fellow fire department, your police, your EMS, they're actually not going to give a rave review and say, hey, you need to volunteer for this organization. So it really starts long before you're actually bringing people in. How many people in your organization has, thank you, delete. Yes, absolutely. And you can use more experienced people to start to build their leadership skills and start to break your units down. Thank you. It's a very, very good idea. And it creates sustainability. Absolutely, delete. Thank you for that. And we'll talk about even into some training and things like that shortly, but yeah, well said. How many of you thought about what your brand is? Now, I'm not Richard Branson or Tony Robbins or anything like that, or a marketing guru, but have you thought about what your brand is? I would suspect that we probably haven't. Using logos, messaging, walking the walk. Who are you as an organization? What is making you tick? Why would somebody want to belong to your organization? All of those things need to be consistent. Right? And I get that, man, relax. We're not marketing people. We're not writing copy. We're not doing all this fancy dancy Twitter and everything like that. Well, the reality is you have to have a consistent message, a consistent brand, a consistent look when you're dealing with the community, you're out in the public, and so on and so forth. So keep that in mind. What is your brand? Is it one of quality? Is it one of, we're just happy to be here? Is it one of, doing the best we can, best effort? I don't know. And only you as an organization, leaders within organizations can decide what that looks like. Oh, Katie's an actual marketing major. Okay, so any questions, refer to Katie, please. All right, branding. It's super important. We market our services as volunteer organizations, right? And whether we like it or not, that's the reality, especially when we're dealing with some tasking agencies like, say, law enforcement that may transition in and out of a detachment or a service area. We're constantly having to market ourselves. So make sure that your brand is on point, making sure that it's of high quality, it's good messaging, and it's consistent. And it starts long before you're actually bringing a recruit in. So with regard to that, be organized when it comes time to start to recruit. So things like, if somebody were to phone in and ask to be a member, do you get back to them right away? Or is it, yeah, thank you very much for that, and and nobody gets back to them. So what message are you telling that potential recruit? Means that you're probably not organized, you don't give a shit about them, and recruiting isn't really a key part of what you do, for example. Okay, so be organized. Have a membership committee. Have somebody that's answering those phone calls, answering those emails, because those interactions are right off the bat with the potential new recruit. Because remember, they're evaluating, whether it be conscious or subconscious, they're constantly evaluating. Stay on that brand, right? So talk to Katie. She'll help you through branding exercise. What is your message? What's your avatar? What's your market? So on and so forth. So thanks for that. But yeah, and Christina, it's absolutely a critical point. We are marketing amongst our stakeholders. That's the reality. Whether you like it or not, and I get you just joined fire department just to put the wet stuff on the red stuff and SAR because you want 8 headlamps, although we now know that that's not actually why we join. We join because of how belonging to that organization makes us feel. Okay, but we have to recognize that with that comes a lot of that admin stuff, and we'll talk about that. Do have an orientation. Absolutely. And I'll talk about why that is the case. All right. So in our chat, how many people, let's see if we can do it. Yeah, so let's do this. Let's use the magic of technology. And I'm gonna just post, so within your orientation, so you've got 30 new people, for example, they're gathered in a conference room, boardroom, a community hall, whatever that looks like. How many people go over policies, procedures, and the time commitment? Okay, so go ahead and answer that. Oh, hold on, let me publish that. It's probably easier. That's part of your kind of orientation. How many people go over policies, procedures, and commitment? All right. Okay. So we've got 50-50. Okay. All right. Well, now it's 60. So no. Okay. All right. So that's so majority are no on that. Now let's take a look at the next step. How many discuss the why of your organization, not just the what? I'm actually quite curious. Just for context, when I talk about what, I'm talking about what you do. You know, at fire service, we fire suppression, we do technical rescue, we cut people out of vehicles, whatever the case is. All right, good. So we've got a majority that say yes. That's great. That's really, really good, because the why is critical for people. And that is why we're going to talk about how it ties into volunteerism again in a little bit more in the future here shortly. But why we do what we do is so important, because the what, that can change even throughout someone, a volunteer's career. The what can change, the mission can change, but the why, that's the part that gets people up. That's the part that I volunteer as a search and rescue responder to. I do that because I know my why. You know, otherwise I would go and volunteer somewhere else. But there's absolutely nothing better than, you know, to have a conversation after, you know, somewhere in Katrina and 67-year-old woman, Cora, wonderful lady. Long story, but one of the things that she said once she got out of the hospital was, you know, don't forget that you not only made a difference in my life, but also my husband's life, my children's life, and my grandchildren's life. You know, and to me, that's what it's all about, right? It's about making a difference, the bigger why. And that's what keeps me coming back after all these years. So allow your people, even in the orientation, to try to connect to what that why is. Make that visceral connection. Because the what, yeah, that's cool and great, but that can get old, right? And the why is the feeling that is associated with how I'm going to do something and why I do it. So that's that connection. So it's really important to talk about that. So I'm glad to see that a lot of us talk about the why. And again, it's not just the mission, why we do it. Well, we do it because people go missing, or we do it because there's fires in houses. That's not what I'm talking about. Why? We serve the community. We help people. We reunite loved ones. We alleviate suffering. All of those things. That's the why of our organizations. Okay? Not why do we put water on the fire to put it out. Great. That's not what I'm talking about here. Connect with people. Connect with that why. And what's really interesting, and we'll talk about it, is that whoever you have during your orientation, have them talk about their why, not the what of, you know, what we do as an organization. Have somebody talk about why they volunteer. The other thing too is we will often rely heavily on the liability, and I get it, totally get it. I'm not ignoring the fact that we're legally bound by so many different things. We have a standard of care, we have duties of care, all of those things. I'm not ignoring that at all. But I can tell you that the liability card gets old, and that's also, you're using liability as a means of fear to motivate people. Okay. So you're using fear. You will get sued, you will cause problems, you will be called, negligent, so on, so on, so on. Well, that's great from an organizational perspective, but that's not why people belong to organizations. Remove that fear, that liability fear, for example. And I know that in search and rescue, we're pretty, we rely heavily on that liability word, and same with fire and EMS, of course. So just try not to use that word too much. It's a factor, definitely, but that's not really why we do it. That's not why I joined SAR, to make sure, or that's not why I train. I don't train because I want to be legally protected. I train because that makes me a better search manager. That makes me a better SAR responder, or when we go into Fort Mac, makes me a better planning section chief in the EOC, whatever that looks like. It's very, very important. So tell your services story. I work a lot with military, and one of the first things that military units do across the gamut is they tell the history of the organization, because that's now starting to connect people with the history, the tradition, the story that is the service. And that's really, really important because, again, you're asking people to feel good about volunteering, feel good about your organization. So it's important that we tell what that story is, because you know what? Fire departments, SAR groups, EMS providers, organizations have great stories. They really, really do. How they came to be, why they're there, some of the history with regard to some of the big events, Slave Lake, for example, so on and so forth. And have those members that have been with the organization for a little while come up and tell the story, unscripted, warts and all. They don't have to be excellent orators, but you know what they do need to be is authentic and real. And tell the people in the audience why they volunteer, why they get a charge out of it, how it makes them feel. And that will connect with the folks in the room. Now, what's interesting is if you're doing that, it won't connect with everybody. And that's perfect. That's what we're trying to go for. We don't want to eliminate people based on liability or any of these fear tactics or time commitment, all those things. What we really want to do is try to figure out the people that get it, the people that connect with our why. Those are the folks that will stick with us through thick and thin. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to tell the story of our members. We're trying to tell the story of our organization. We're trying to tell the why. That's what we're trying to do and make those connections with new members. Yeah, and the current operational policies are always a challenge. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I get that. That's the reality that we work in. There are certain things we have to do for liability and so on and so forth, and that just is. But what we want to try to do is really take the focus off of that as much as possible and really amplify the why, the feelings of tradition, the mission. Why is what we're doing important from a subject perspective, from a homeowner perspective, from a member of the public, from a public safety perspective. It makes a big difference. And I know for me in SAR, one of the big reasons is if I had a loved one missing, I want somebody to come out and find them. And those people that come out and find them, I want them to be the best trained. Absolutely, I do. And so that's, really where I get into it. And when you're really busy operationally, your why is constantly reinforced, and that's the beautiful thing. So, you may have less of a sales job needed because the why is pretty in your face all the time. So that's something to keep in mind. So think about your brand, evaluate your process end to end, including the orientation. Don't be haphazard about it. Don't be ad hoc. Evaluate how your members act amongst the community. Now, the challenge sometimes with regard to organizations is we bring people in halfway through a process. Like we ask them to come out on a Wednesday night, for example, and attend training. Hey, yeah, we're doing ropes that night. Well, that's a great way of, introducing them to the organization. I get it. But what you're asking is you're parachuting them into a culture that they have no idea about, no real context for it. And who knows, that Wednesday night may be exactly opposite of what you culturally really want to convey. Maybe it is somebody just being pretty direct in front of the class, because it's a skill that's very specific, and you need a lot of direction. Well, that's not necessarily the culture that you want to do. So if at all possible, maybe have them attend that, but try to do orientations as often. If you need to do more orientation, then so be it. But it sets the stage right off the bat of what right looks like. And you can connect the why to that individual through that orientation piece. So evaluate the onboarding process end to end. Don't be haphazard about it. Don't be ad hoc. Don't be best effort, because this is really where you're setting the tone for potential members. It's very, very important. All right, retention. This is a busy slide here, just because I decided to pack a lot into it. That's how I'm rolling. All right, so let's take a look at this. We have the volunteer life cycle, and we have our traditional curve. Now, just by definition, the curve is that most people fall there. That's just math, right? Now, on one end of the spectrum, or one end of the curve, let's look at it from the casual, disinterested, highly selective. Okay, so those are the individuals that are kind of on the tail end. Every organization has them. They join because they like the crest. They join when it's convenient. They do what they need to do, the absolute bare minimum, and probably even less than that. That's where they live. Thankfully, that's not the majority of folks. The majority of people are right in the middle. And that's this risk benefit. Again, by definition of the curve, most of those people are there. So this risk benefit balance, think about this. We know what it looks like operationally. There's always a risk and a benefit. The risk of going in to the water to rescue somebody, what is the benefit, and so on and so forth. Body recovers. We're constantly coming under this risk benefit equation. Well, members also have this kind of way of thinking about it. And it really comes down to, how much do I need to do to keep the feeling? That feeling of community, that feeling of coolness, that feeling of really liking what I'm doing. How much do I have to do? Now, recognizing that in emergency services, there's so much inherently that we're asking of our volunteers, our unpaid professionals, that you wouldn't get in a lot of volunteer organizations. That's the reality. We are requiring them to have basic equipment. We are requiring them to undergo a whole bunch of basic training that would make most volunteers, their heads spin. They'd be like, screw that. They'd pop smoke and they'd be out of there. So there's just things that we're asking our volunteers to do that are just inherently rigorous. There's a high volume of training required, a high volume of certification, a high commitment, all of those things. So we've already got that working kind of against us from an organizational perspective. It's not just show up every Wednesday night, or one Wednesday a year. Okay, so already we're putting a bit of a burden on our folks. But conversely, though, we're actually hopefully giving them a whole bunch of benefits, and we'll talk about that. All right, so just be aware of that as an organization. We're already asking them to do a lot. What we want to do is get people over to that right attitude, strong commitment, highly dedicated. And every organization has them too. These are the individuals that have 3 Leatherman. These are the individuals that have 2 cell phones. These are the individuals that basically have the group t-shirt, and that's all they wear. They are the individual that are search and rescue workers. They are firemen and firefighters. They are medics in the rural communities. Like, that's what their identity is. So we have to be aware that every organization has them. Here's the interesting thing, though, tying it back to my story, and I think it's quite similar to everyone else's. Your context changes. Like, if I look back throughout my, say, 28 years and counting, I've been all of these things, and it's changed. So therein, when we talk about how we're going to, interact with people, well, it's important to recognize, where are they and where is our organization on this spectrum? Are they casually disinterested? Are they in the right attitude, strong community, highly dedicated? No, chances are they're evaluating constantly. And remember, we talked about the competition for time and attention. It sucks, I get it, but that's the reality. We are constantly competing. So the context changes, and it's not based on the individual. Like there's no judgment there. That is just the reality. That just happens. Somebody has a new kid, whatever that looks like. All sorts of things change. They lose a job. They are going to go to casual, disinterest, highly selective, because that's just their life stage at that moment. But really what will drive the how they feel about things is our strength of relationships. And just to and we're 1 hour into this, so I apologize, but think about the worst thing that somebody can do in jail. What is the number one punishment that somebody that's a total badass, they're kicking the crap out of inmates, whatever it is, what do they make them do? Solitary confinement. They isolate them. They're surrounded by bad guys, bad gals, whatever, murderers, you name it. And the worst thing they do, like to make it worse, they put them in solitary confinement. So that goes to show strength of relationships, how we interact amongst individuals. That's what drives us. That's what makes us want to belong to an organization. Now, the role of training, super, super important, because the reality is we train more than we do anything else. Hopefully, we're doing more training than we are public relations or administration, for example. So we have to be very deliberate. So is your training meeting the needs of the members as well as the organization? So this is where some of the things have changed, where I know when I started in SAR, for example, and even to a certain extent Canada Task Force 2, we had requirements and really didn't care a lot about the members. Really, if you want to belong to us, here it is. Make it, suck it up. If it works for you, great. If it doesn't, oh well. Unfortunately, we can't be that way anymore. So remember, what's in it for me? That's really, really important in terms of retention. That's a constant discussion or thinking point in our members' minds. So is our training meeting the needs of the members as well as the organization? Crawl, walk, and run. We're very, very good at running in emergency services. And the reason being is because that's how we learned, right? Hey man, tough shit. That's how I learned. Just keep up. So we want to crawl, we want to walk, we want to run. Start with the technical aspects of our tasks. If it's on the fire ground, start with those very basic technical things. Start with the equipment. How do we assemble gear? So on and so forth. How do we deploy hoses? How do we operate certain pieces of equipment from a technical perspective? If you're talking about on the EMS side, the technical skills are the ones like, how do we work some of the equipment, right? How do we deploy stretchers? All of those things. On the SAR side, the technical aspects of it are, some of the equipment we use, some of the tactics, those sorts of things. So every emergency service kind of has a bunch of technical aspects of it. Start there, period. Okay? But a lot of times we do scar tissue learning, right? We throw a bunch of crap at somebody and see how they act, see how they behave, because in the real world, that's what's going to happen. They're going to have to think on their feet. They can't panic. Yeah, absolutely. Legit. But before you get there, make sure they know the technical aspects of the job. Especially in our organizations, you're getting people from all walks of life. And in fact, sometimes you're getting somebody with a lot of previous experience, and in some ways they have to change how they do business. So once you've done those technical aspects, this is now where we need to go. Train for communication, decision-making, leadership. So once they've done those technical aspects, there's a lot of things that they can be doing once they've learned that. And we start to see that in organizations where people, or at least hopefully we see that in organizations that have a very experienced membership, because they've got the technical aspects down pat. They can run a Mark III pump or name your apparatus. They've got all that dialed in. Well, now start to layer some other skills on. Training for that communication, making decisions, leadership skills. The list goes on and on and on with regard to extra layers that you should start to be moving your people beyond. So Lee earlier talked about letting more experienced people lead those individuals. 100% correct. Absolutely, that's a great technique. When you get experienced members, delegate. say, hey, can you start looking after this type of thing in terms of training? Set up a training night, whatever that looks like. So very, very good way to leverage the experience you have in your organization. So not only is it a force multiplier that you don't have to be doing all the training, but it's also involving those with a lot of experience. And Karen, absolutely correct. Succession planning is sometimes under-focused in volunteer organizations. I would argue even not just sometimes, I would say an awful lot with regard to volunteer organizations. And that's exactly a critical point with regard to creating that culture. What we see is a changeover rapidly, a lot of transient population, tough for that culture to stay there, but you have to have some sort of succession planning. You also have to have career pathing. So when I'm a new member, what does it look like in 5 years? Do I now get exposure to technical rescue, swift water, whatever that looks like? I don't know. I want to know those types of things. So yeah, really, really good point. Now, in terms of if you're doing your technical aspects, if you're training for communication, decision-making, leadership, establish that baseline. And now this is where our environment is different than a lot of them. Then introduce stress. Okay, do that baseline technical expertise. Then you need to start introducing stress, because everything we do operationally involves stress. Everything. Even giving a briefing to a bunch of people, there is a certain amount of stress. But when we're on the fire ground, when we're searching a segment, we're doing patient care, there is a level of stress inherent in how we do our jobs, how we run calls, and so on and so forth. So how many times do we introduce stress? Well, sometimes it's too early. Sometimes it's too late. So the key is that every training evolution needs to focus on that technical aspect of it first. And then once that person's ready to roll, introduce some stress to them. Once they've done that, introduce communicating on that baseline of communication. And then once they've got kind of that technical aspect of it, introduce communicating under stress, and so on and so forth. So if you look at it from a career perspective, career pathing, there's an awful lot of things that we can do as trainers to keep people evolving through that ladder in our organization, so that we're constantly pushing them, we're constantly introducing things, and the technical aspects are always there. But as organizations, as leaders, let's start layering stress on, build that next level up of competency, add stress, and so on and so forth. So think about that in terms of your training programs. So the takeaway, what do we give that member? Be deliberate about this, because I think we get complacent, in terms of our processes. What do we give that member? Remember, they're required to do a lot more than most organizations. So what are you doing to counteract what you need from them, right? Again, we're very good at telling people what they need to do, but we're not always super great at reciprocating. It's not just about cool training or kick-ass gear. Big part of it, don't want to lie, I'm not going to bullshit here. Absolutely, it's about some pretty cool gear, because I feel good wearing expensive Arc'teryx clothes. That's me, that's how I roll. Okay, for sure. Now, are we giving them a sense of involvement, a sense of value, that they matter, that you truly care about them? The advancement, career pathing, the training they can apply to their family work life. So it's not just about, well, we give them all of their 1001s, we give them great gear. No. Dig deeper. How are we accommodating the sense of belonging? How are we cultivating the sense of relationships, or how are we building stronger relationships? How are we making them feel good about belonging to the organization? It's not about the gear. It's not just about the training. It's about all of these other things, the intrinsic that we have to think about. Whiteboard, literally on a whiteboard. Okay, so and you'll be quite surprised. What do we need from that member? We've got legislation, regulation, liability, administrative, PR. So yes, all of those things we do need from that member. Let's include some hours in there. And from there, you get what we call an MVP, minimal viable product. What that means is, what is the bare minimum we need to kick somebody out the door and they're going to be functioning, safe, risk management wise. We're taking care of all of that stuff and we're meeting the requirements of the mission. Okay, what's the minimum? Because I know, having been there, done that as a leader of an organization, I've been like, well, they know this already. Well, geez, they need to know this. Do they? Yes. Yes, they do need to know. Well, why? I don't know. I don't know why, but they just need to. So what we start doing is we kind of start moving the yardsticks to what they absolutely need minimally to what do we want them to have. It's a big difference. So be very aware of what you need from members and also what you just want from them. Once you have that on your whiteboard, then you can start to look and say, are we combining needs and wants? Because the wants, we can peel those off and we can make those now advanced skills. We can make those career pathing opportunities. But for your bare minimum firefighter, your bare minimum SAR worker, what do we require of them? So this, perfect. Well, you know what? I would love them to have, to be expert trackers, for example. Yeah, for sure. I would love that in an organization. Do I want that or do I need that? Well, maybe you do need it. I don't know. Only you as an organization can decide that. But are we putting an undue burden on people, on our volunteers who are already strapped for time? It just is. Are we asking them to do more because of what we want them to do or what we need them to do? Very, very important exercise. And then that just puts it into perspective. Because I know there's going to be a lot of needs. There absolutely is. Guess what? Maybe you stop there, depending on your organization. But think about that as an organization. Are we needing them to do it or do we want them to do it? Two completely different things.